The morning of December 8, 1981, started like any other workday, but it quickly turned into a fight for survival for thousands of people. Commuters left their houses expecting a normal trip to the office, but they found themselves stuck in a nightmare that lasted for 7 hours. Cars couldn't move and were left empty in ditches along the roads. Buses tried to drive up hills, but they lost traction and just stopped halfway up. Nobody was ready for this. There had been no proper warnings given to the public. Suddenly, roads were as slippery as skating rinks. Train services were cancelled, airports locked their doors, and telephone lines snapped under the weight of the weather. This chaos was the start of a 7-week period that would push Britain to its limit. It was shocking because the month had started out feeling very different. In the first few days of December, the weather was actually mild. On the 3rd of the month, the city of Aberdeen recorded a temperature of 15 degrees. It was so warm that people were walking around outside wearing only light jackets. It felt like winter had decided to miss Britain completely that year. But that changed instantly on December 7th. The wind direction shifted and started blowing from the north. Freezing air from the Arctic rushed down over the country. By the time people woke up on the 8th, heavy snow had covered the southern part of England. In areas like Wiltshire and Berkshire, the snow was already 15 centimeters deep. The cold didn't stop there, it just gripped the country tighter. A few days later, on December 11th, another massive snowstorm attacked. This time, London took the biggest hit. In the suburbs of the city, snow piled up until it was 25 to 30 centimeters deep. The weather was so bad that the government struggled to do its job. Even the Queen was affected. She got stuck in a pub in the Cotswolds for several hours because she couldn't travel. No one was safe from the weather. Then came the night of December 13th, which is remembered as the night the country truly froze solid. Across large parts of the nation, the temperature dropped below -18 degrees. In Shropshire, the thermometer fell all the way to -25.2 degrees. That was the coldest temperature ever recorded in England for the month of December. In Wales, the town of Corwen hit -22.7 degrees. Weather records that had existed for more than 100 years were broken in just one single night. While people on land were freezing, the ocean became deadly. Strong winds turned the falling snow into blinding storms over the water. During that week, 2 ships sank in the English Channel. The waves were so strong they broke through the sea defenses along the Bristol Channel. On December 19th, a tragedy happened off the coast of Cornwall that broke the nation's heart. A cargo ship was in trouble, and the Penley lifeboat crew went out to help them. The lifeboat capsized in the rough water. 16 people lost their lives that day. The sea took those brave men who had gone out to fight a storm that was impossible to beat. Back on land, the country was sad, but the cold weather did not care. It kept coming, wave after wave. The cold took over every part of life. It was so cold that your breath would turn to ice in the air. Inside houses, ice started to form on the inside of the windows. This wasn't just a thin layer of frost that you could wipe off. It was thick, hard ice that you would need to use a knife to remove. Waking up in the morning required mental preparation. Your bedroom felt like a freezer, and the bathroom was even colder. You had to get dressed very quickly to avoid freezing. In 1981, having central heating was a luxury that many families did not have. Most people had to rely on a single coal fire downstairs. That meant only one room in the house had any heat. The rest of the house felt like the Arctic. Families would crowd together in the living room. Everyone wore every jumper they owned and wrapped blankets around their shoulders. People would stretch their hands out toward the fire, but it barely warmed you unless you were sitting right next to it. Going to sleep was a challenge. You had to dive under heavy blankets. Sometimes, people used 4 or 5 layers of bedding just to stay warm. You had to lay out your clothes for the next day at the bottom of the bed. If you left them in a drawer, the fabric would be frozen when you tried to put it on in the morning. Some people even slept in their coats. They didn't do this because they were poor, they did it because it was the only way to get through the night without getting hypothermia. The snow kept falling. More came on December 20th, and then again on the 27th. By the time Christmas Day arrived, the snow around Lincoln was 33 centimeters deep. In North London, it was 10 inches deep. The main problem wasn't just the snow itself, it was that the temperatures stayed below freezing for weeks. This meant the snow never had a chance to melt. It just piled up, one layer on top of another, week after week. The cold was powerful enough to freeze rivers solid. Harbors turned to ice. In some parts of the southern coast, the sea itself actually froze. When the tide went out, big blocks of ice were left sitting on the beaches. Fishing boats got stuck in the ice and couldn't move. Inland, the roads completely disappeared. In some places, the snowdrifts were 6 meters high. Entire villages were cut off from the rest of the world. No delivery trucks could get in, and no mail could get out. Mothers started storing up food early in December. They lined up bottles of milk and extra bread because the fridge wasn't big enough to hold it all. Running out of food was not an option because shops were closing and roads were blocked. If you forgot to buy something, you just had to live without it. The only other choice was to knock on a neighbor's door and hope they had some to spare. Simply trying to get to a shop became a major expedition. People would stand in lines outside of bakeries early in the morning. It was normal to wait in the cold for an hour just to buy a single loaf of bread. Inside the stores, the shelves became empty very quickly. Sugar vanished completely. Shopkeepers started rationing butter, only selling it to regular customers they recognized. If you lived in a village that was cut off by the snow, you had to survive on whatever you had already stored in your cupboards. Some families did not see fresh milk for 2 weeks. Putting tinned condensed milk into tea became the new normal. It was the taste of survival. Power cuts happened all the time. More than 250,000 homes lost electricity during the month of December. The ice and snow weighed down the overhead power lines and caused them to fail. When the power went out, everything in the house stopped. There was no light and no heating. Families had to rely on candles and coal fires. They would sit in the dark, playing cards and telling stories to keep warm, waiting hours for the lights to flicker back on. Schools closed their doors, not just for a day, but for weeks. For children in some areas, it felt like Christmas had arrived early. They had total freedom and no lessons. They spent their time building snow forts that stayed frozen until the new year. Sledges were pulled out of every shed. If you didn't have a sledge, you stole a tea tray from the kitchen or borrowed a baking sheet. Kids used anything that would slide on the snow. Every street had a hill that the local children protected like their own territory. They would spend the whole day racing down the hill and walking back up. They would get soaking wet and cold, but they were smiling. Their gloves would freeze stiff, but nobody cared because it was the best winter of their lives. The snow was so deep that you could walk right over the tops of hedges and gates. But for adults, life was hard. Elderly people struggled to stay warm, and hospitals were full of people suffering from hypothermia. Doctors had to walk through waist-deep snow to visit sick people at home. Their medical bags would freeze solid as they tried to reach patients who were trapped. Helicopters had to drop supplies like bread and medicine to farms that were isolated. Farmers had a terrible time. They had to watch as their animals froze in the fields. Sheep were buried under the snowdrifts, and cattle couldn't move. By January, thousands of animals had died. It cost the farmers a lot of money, but they didn't complain, they just kept working because that is what they did. As December ended, everyone hoped the worst part was finished. On New Year's Day, there was a short break in the weather. It rained instead of snowed, and things started to melt. People felt relieved. But it was a trick. On January 3rd, the cold returned, and it was meaner than before. On the evening of January 7th, 1982, snow began to fall across Wales. This wasn't a light shower, it was a blizzard that refused to stop. For 36 hours, the snow fell continuously, pushed by strong winds from the east. The temperature stayed below freezing, so the snow was dry and powdery. The wind blew it everywhere. By the morning of January 9th, Wales was buried. In some places, the level snow was 60 centimeters deep. But the wind had piled the snow into drifts that were 6 meters high. Some drifts reached 20 feet. Cars completely vanished under the white mounds. Houses looked like igloos. Gates and hedges disappeared. South Wales was totally cut off from the world for 3 days. No roads were open, trains stopped, and airports closed. Millions of people could not get to work. In London, commuters gave up after trying for hours. The Midlands stopped moving. In Wales, towns became isolated islands waiting to be rescued. The army had to be called in. Soldiers arrived with shovels to clear the roads 1 meter at a time. They delivered bread and milk to villages that hadn't seen a delivery van in 2 weeks. Helicopters flew overhead, dropping supplies and picking up people who needed a doctor. In Swansea, the local radio station became a lifeline. It organized help for everyone. If a woman went into labor, the radio would ask for someone with a four-wheel drive to help her. If someone ran out of bread, strangers with Land Rovers would volunteer to deliver it. Farmers let stranded drivers stay in their homes. In the village of Horton, people lived without electricity for days. They had almost no heat or food, and helicopters had to drop bread to them. Residents walked on top of the snow, which was higher than the garden gates below them. But they survived. Moms boiled water in kettles so people could wash with a flannel because there were no baths or showers. Dads constantly checked the coal pile, burning old newspapers and broken furniture to keep the fire alive. Then came January 10th. This was the coldest morning ever recorded in Britain. Braemar in Scotland hit -27.2 degrees Celsius. Newport in Shropshire recorded -26.1 degrees, the coldest temperature ever seen in England in over 300 years of records. That afternoon, the warmest it got in Braemar was still -19.1 degrees. The high temperature for the day was nearly 20 degrees below freezing. The air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass. Your lungs ached and your face burned. Exposed skin went numb in seconds. Even in the south, temperatures stayed below -10 during the day. Eventually, the cold began to fade. By the middle of January, warmer air came in from the west. The snow started to melt, and roads appeared again. When the milkman finally delivered unfrozen milk, people cheered. The big snow of 1982 wasn't just about the weather, it was about community. When streets were buried, neighbors came out to help each other dig out cars. People checked on the elderly every day. In community centers, strangers sat together drinking tea and playing dominoes. The cold changed how people acted. Asking for help wasn't embarrassing, it was necessary. Families actually sat together by the fire and talked. People had less during those weeks, but it felt like they had more. Britain was tired and covered in soot, but it had survived together.